Pharma, in my mind, represents the last 50 years or so of the business, of the industry. And I term it the golden age because we were highly successful in terms of sales and revenue growth, in terms of the creation of very innovative drugs to improve health care throughout the world, in performance, both in quality and efficiency, and in a perceived social benefit of what we were doing. Between the period of 1996 and 2006, sales for U.S. firms rose from 102 billion to 276 billion. At the same time, R&D spending also went up at a rather exponential rate, as shown here. Growth was really driven by the development of blockbuster drugs for the most part, drugs that were efficacious across large populations of individuals, and because we had patent protection in most of the developed country markets. In 1996, the typical pharmaceutical company had about 35,000 employees, and when I left the business to become a consultant, a professor in 2006, what's published in the literature is about 68, the average of 68,000 employees. My experience was it's more like 100,000 employees in most of the big companies. Moving on then to one of the discussions that we often get into is that drugs are expensive, and it's true, we spend a lot of money on R&D, but you'd be really surprised, I think, by this number that if you look at how the total healthcare dollar is segmented, pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs only represent 11 cents of every healthcare dollar in the U.S. And an interesting fact on the right side of this slide, in the little box, is that the generic drugs are growing at a CAGR of about 9% a year over the next few years. And currently, and I wasn't aware of this till I started preparing, that 78% of the prescriptions today are for generic drugs. So nearly 8 in 10 of the prescriptions that are written are filled by generic drugs. A question I put forward to you is that since there are no concessions in the Healthcare Reform Act for R&D, should maybe generic manufacturers be required to contribute something towards R&D or healthcare in this country? The biopharmaceutical industry also represents a large economic engine, and you may not think about this very often, but these are data from 2006, where if you look at the number of people directly employed by the pharmaceutical companies, around 690,000 people were directly employed. If you look at the indirect effect, and indirect is CROs and suppliers of goods and services, or induced in the communities, that's in the communities where we have facilities, that the pharmaceutical industry, total jobs supported are over 3 million jobs supported by the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. If you look at the rate the sector has been growing in the small box on the lower left, the industry has been growing at about 3.1% versus the rest of the economy at about half that rate. So pharma is a big economic engine. If you look at taxes paid by employees, on average about $22,000 in federal taxes a year versus the rest of the economic segments about $7.3 million. So it's a large economic engine in terms of employment. It's likewise a large economic engine in terms of GDP. The total contribution to GDP by the U.S. pharmaceutical industry is close to $300 billion. So it's a huge piece of our economy. Represents the average contribution per employee. If you look at the data on the right side, that way, it's around $128,000 per employee contributing towards GDP versus the rest of our economic segments on average about $75,000 per employee. Also, that segment has been growing faster in terms of GDP creation than the other segments. So then the question you have to ask, I think, is why has the media and certain legislatures been so critical of the pharmaceutical industry?